I think we can go ahead and get started. Good evening, everybody. I'm Dr. Justin Conrad. I'm the director of the Center for International Trade and Security, which is part of the School of Public and International Affairs here at UGA. And we are very appreciative that you are joining us tonight for what is the inaugural event in our Global Decisions Lecture Series, which is hosted by the Center. We have a very exciting program tonight, but before we get to it, let me first cover a couple housekeeping items. First of all, in this webinar format that we have, we cannot see or hear the attendees. So if you have a question, we will have time for questions and answers at the end of the talk. We recommend that you type them into the Q&A box, which you should be able to access at the bottom of your screen. And you can type those in at any point during the program. At the end of the talk, I will select a few of those and I'll read those out loud. Now, let me introduce our guest speaker for the evening. Since this is our very first event in the series, we could not be more fortunate. We have Dr. Hal Brands here to help us kick things off. Dr. Brands is a widely renowned scholar and practitioner of U.S. foreign policy. He is the Henry Kissinger Distinguished Professor of Global Affairs at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And he has been an International Affairs Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He has also served as a consultant to a wide range of government agencies in the intel and national security communities. He served as the Special Assistant to the Secretary of Defense for Strategic Planning from 2015 to 2016. And he was the lead writer for the National Defense Strategy Commission. He is the author or editor of many books, including American Grand Strategy in the Age of Trump, From Berlin to Baghdad, America's Search for Purpose in the Post-Cold War World. And his newest book is The Lessons of Tragedy, Statecraft and World Order. And all of those are available from your favorite retailers. And as if that's not enough, you can catch him frequently at Bloomberg, where he is an opinion columnist. So let's give a very warm welcome to Dr. Hal Brands.
Well, thank you, Justin. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm honored to be part of this series. As I was just watching the slides that we're scrolling through before we started, which are alerting us to some of the other folks who will be speaking here. It just looks like a tremendous group of events. And so I am truly honored to be able to help kick it off. I'm also just delighted to see that Justin has one of the 7 books that actually sold for the Lessons of Tragedy. So I'm glad to see that one found a good home. I am sorry that I cannot be there in person with everyone tonight. I think obviously that would be a lot more fun, but we'll do our best given the circumstances that we're in. So let me go ahead and get to the substance. I thought it would be appropriate, since we are in the middle of what looks to be a fairly messy presidential transition, to talk about where U.S. foreign policy might go in the future under a Biden administration. But I'm actually going to save the explicit discussion of that for kind of the last quarter of my talk, because what I want to do starting out is to frame that assessment against the longer trajectory of American strategy in the past. I'm going to take the longer view, in fact, the much longer view. I want to go all the way back to World War II, which really ushers in the modern era in American foreign policy, talk about what post-war foreign policy was and how it evolved after the end of the Cold War, and then how we ended up where we are today at the end of a somewhat disruptive era in American foreign policy and amid a global pandemic. And then I'll talk about what some of the challenges and opportunities are for the incoming Biden administration. And the overall argument I'm going to offer over the next half hour or so is that we really have reached a potential tipping point in the longer run trajectory of American foreign policy. We always say that we're at a tipping point in American foreign policy. I think this is actually the case because of a number of the international challenges the United States faces and some of the internal trends in American foreign policy and American politics. over recent years. But the hopeful interpretation I want to leave you with is that tipping points don't necessarily have to lead you in a bad direction. I think there are actually some very interesting strategic opportunities for the United States in the coming years if we can resurrect a tradition of constructive international leadership that we followed for many decades, that in some ways we have departed from more recently. And so that's the overall thrust of my talk this evening. But let me start by going back about 75 years to the end of World War II. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that World War II really ushered in a strategic revolution for the United States. What we think of as American foreign policy today really emerged during and after World War II, and it did so on the basis of a twofold logic that came to American policymakers during that conflict. And the two pillars that I'm talking about might be thought of as interdependence and indispensability. And so the idea of interdependence simply reflects the fact that the Great Depression and World War II made clear to American policymakers that the United States could not be secure in a world that was racked by war and aggression. It could not be prosperous in a world that was laid prone by depression. It could not preserve its own democracy in a world in which aggressive autocracies ran wild. And so it became clear that the United States couldn't just look after its own security and prosperity in narrow terms after World War II. It couldn't simply limit its strategic horizons to the Western Hemisphere. It was going to have to take on the role of creating a larger world order, a larger global environment in which the United States could flourish. So that was the interdependence logic. The indispensability logic came from the fact that it was only the United States that could do this. There was no other power in the world that combined both the ability to create a world order and the willingness to create a world order in which the United States would be comfortable. Obviously, the second most powerful nation in the world after World War II was the Soviet Union, which had a vastly different view of what it wanted to accomplish. The British Empire was essentially kaput after World War II, although it would take another couple of decades for that process to play out. And so after World War II, even during the war, American policymakers really committed to creating what we now think of as the liberal international order, the international system that we have today. And that system was premised on the creation of a relatively open global economy, one that was never perfect, but was going to be more liberal, more conducive to free trade than certainly had been the case during the 1930s. The United States would take on the role of providing stability and deterring aggression in key regions like East Asia and Western Europe. It would take a leading role in international institutions, organizations like the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, the United Nations, that were meant to promote cooperation in accordance with American interests. And while it would not promote democracy and human rights in all cases, in general, it would try to create an international system in which democracies could be secure and human rights could flourish. Now, this foreign policy really emerged in fullest form during the Cold War in the context of the effort to contain the Soviet Union. But in fact, the United States had made the decision to try to create this broader international system even before the Cold War unfolded. It was really a reaction to World War II and the havoc that it wreaked on the prior international system. Now, I want to make an important point here that the United States made plenty of compromises, moral and otherwise, along the way in creating this international system. The United States supported bloodthirsty dictators in Latin America and elsewhere in the Third World during the Cold War. It was involved in coups and other unsorted business as part of the struggle against the Soviet Union. The United States made many, many mistakes. It made errors of omission and errors of commission during the Cold War. We have to keep in mind that foreign policy is never a game of perfect. It's never about getting everything right. It's about getting things just right enough. And in fact, I would submit that that's what the United States did during most of the post-war era. And so, compared to sort of a perfect standard, the post-war era has been full of problems. Compared to any other era in human history, it has been a golden age. If you look at the growth of both American and global prosperity over the past 75 years, if you look at the fact that there hasn't been a great power war, a war between the most powerful actors in the international system since 1945. If you look at the fact that democracy has spread more widely than ever before over the past 75 years, these have been 75 really good years for the United States and for most of the world as well. And in fact, the international system that the United States and its allies created was critical in winning the Cold War and ultimately ending that conflict in the 1980s. And so this is kind of the post-war tradition in American foreign policy. It's a tradition that rests on the idea that the United States should provide enlightened leadership of the international system, not as a matter of charity, but because doing so will create a world in which the United States is most likely to be secure, prosperous, and democratic. All right, so that's the post-war era. Then the Cold War ends in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and American policymakers faced a choice regarding what they were going to do next. It wasn't necessarily obvious at the time that the post-Cold War era would be relatively stable. If you think back to the beginning of the post-Cold War era, so let's say the years 1990 and 1991, there was a great deal of instability, both actual and potential, in the international system. The Berlin Wall opens in 1989. That's a good thing. But it leaves this question of what's going to happen to a divided Germany? What's going to happen to the former Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe? Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait in 1990, ushering in the prospect of a much more, of an international system in which aggression becomes more widespread because Cold War constraints are relaxed. The Soviet Union itself collapses in 1991, and so on and so forth. By this time, in fact, there's broken out a vicious ethnic conflict in Europe, in the former Yugoslavia. And so there's actually a famous piece that's written back in 1990 by a very well-known political scientist named John Mearsheimer called "Why We Will Soon Miss the Cold War." And basically the idea here was that once the Cold War was over, the United States would presumably withdraw its troops from Europe. It would pull back from its efforts to shape the world because the Soviet threat was gone, and that the world would kind of revert to its natural, unstable, anarchic state. You would have nuclear arms races in Eastern Europe. Russia and Germany would once again become rivals, and so on and so forth. And so American policymakers are looking at this scenario in 1990, 1991, and they make some fundamental decisions. And the most fundamental of these decisions was this, that the United States was not going to stop with the global engagement project it had been pushing over the past 45 years. It was actually going to double down on that project in the environment of the post-Cold War era. And so in each of the crises that I just mentioned, particularly the crisis after the opening of the Berlin Wall or the Persian Gulf crisis and war in 1990-91, the United States plays a leading role in terms of trying to tamp down or reverse sources of instability. So reversing Saddam Hussein's aggression in Kuwait, for instance, and trying to ensure that the United States would continue to play this stabilizing, relatively benign role in international politics. And in fact, the grand strategy that the United States had pursued during the post-war era simply evolves a little bit for the post-Cold War era. And so the United States says, look, we can continue promoting democracy and human rights. We can do so actually more assertively now that the Soviet bloc has collapsed. The United States had helped create a thriving free world economy during the Cold War. Now it could pursue a globalization agenda on a broader scale. The United States had contained Soviet influence during the Cold War. Now it would commit to containing or rolling back the lesser threats that might otherwise mess up the post-Cold War era. Things like nuclear proliferation, rogue states, later international terrorism, and so on and so forth. And the United States would remain forward deployed militarily, diplomatically, and in other senses as a source of stability in the post-Cold War environment. Those were the basic decisions that American policymakers made after the Cold War ended. And in fact, that was the basic framework for American policy in the post-Cold War era. There was lots of variation in terms of specific policies across presidencies and even within presidencies. And so just to give you one example, obviously Bill Clinton's policy towards Saddam Hussein's Iraq is much different than George W. Bush's policy towards Saddam Hussein's Iraq. China policy was always an issue of contention, with every president lambasting the China policy of his predecessor during the 1990s and after. But at a very high level, there was a great deal of continuity in American foreign policy. The United States maintained and expanded the global network of alliances that it created during the Cold War, even though the Cold War was over. It maintained the forward force deployments that lent credibility to those alliances, even though the overseas US troop presence did shrink and shift somewhat after the Cold War ended. All four post-Cold War administrations continued to promote free trade and human rights and democracy, albeit with varying levels of emphasis. And at all times, the United States remained committed to maintaining the world's strongest military so that it could deter emerging rivals and deal with threats. And the part that I think is maybe perhaps more controversial, I would submit that this was actually a pretty successful foreign policy. Again, it's easy to identify the mistakes that the United States made during the post-Cold War era. There were times when the United States did too little. So it arguably waited too long to intervene in the Balkans in the mid-1990s. It did too little in dealing with the Rwandan genocide in 1994. It's even easier to identify cases in which the United States did too much. I think most of us would probably put the Iraq War at the top of that list. But that said, I think it's important to keep these mistakes in perspective. Go back to any period in American foreign policy, even a period that we think of as being uniquely successful, like the early post-war era, and think of all of the mistakes and catastrophes that characterized American foreign policy during that era. We think about the Truman years as a golden age of American grand strategy right now. When Harry Truman left office, his popularity ratings were kind of in the high 20s, and the United States was mired in an extremely costly war on the Korean Peninsula. And so the point I just want to make here is that mistakes are actually quite common. Even tragedies are quite common in American foreign policy. And in fact, I would say that the accomplishments of post-Cold War foreign policy are pretty good. So yes, there is instability in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union right now. But in fact, Europe's trajectory since the end of the Cold War has been tremendous. The sphere of democracy and market economics has moved to the east. NATO expanded. The United States helped extinguish ethnic conflicts in the former Yugoslavia. If you look at the relative stability in East Asia after the Cold War, if you look at the fact that countries like Japan and Germany did not become revisionist powers, as was often feared at the time, but instead stayed closely tied strategically to the United States, it has a lot to do with the fact that the United States maintained this global engagement project that it had initially created during the Cold War. And so overall, there are plenty of things to be critical of in thinking about American foreign policy. But if the basic question is, has American foreign policy since the end of the Cold War helped to create and preserve a better international system, one that is more favorable to the United States than you would have absent that American engagement? I think the answer is indisputably yes. So that's the good part of the analysis. But that raises an obvious question, which is, why has the American-led world order come under such tremendous strain today? I think if you were to ask people in the DC policy community or people who study this stuff for a living, you would find that there is a general consensus that the liberal international order, the American-led international system, is under stress. And some people would even argue that it is falling apart. There's sometimes a degree of exaggeration involved in here, but I think there are some real challenges that the United States and the international system it has led face today. And I would bin these in about 3 or 4 different categories. Part of it does have to do with American errors and American overreach. I think the United States did become disastrously overcommitted in Iraq in the early 2000s as part of a project that was far less successful than its architects would have hoped. And that has both promoted lasting instability in the Middle East and lasting skepticism about American foreign policy today. If you think about somebody who is, let's say, 25 years old right now, their earliest memories of American foreign policy may be about this war that went catastrophically awry in the Middle East. And so it's not surprising that the Iraq War has promoted a degree of general skepticism about American foreign policy, not inappropriate either. A second factor, I think more important, is actually simply that the balance of power has shifted since the early post-Cold War era. The United States just had an unassailable lead over any potential competitor, an unassailable military lead, an unassailable economic lead over any potential competitor in the early 1990s. Now, partially as a result of American policies, partially as a result of the fact that the United States has placed so much emphasis on fostering a more globalized, open economy in which even potential competitors like China can flourish, the balance of power has shifted significantly over the past 30 years. China's GDP rose in real terms about tenfold from the early 1990s to 2016. Its military spending increased by a similar amount. Now, American officials had long hoped that a rising China could be integrated into the existing international system. And they hoped that if the United States drew China into the global economy, if it helped facilitate Chinese development, then over time, China would become a responsible stakeholder, that was the phrase, in the system that had made it more prosperous and more influential. And that economic liberalization over time would lead to political liberalization. And so you could afford to make this bet on pursuing a policy that would actually strengthen a potential challenger like China, on the expectation that you would simultaneously be pacifying this country and perhaps encouraging its liberalization as well. 25, 30 years on, it doesn't appear that that bet has paid off, or at least it hasn't paid off on a time scale that will be useful for the United States right now. And so as the balance of power has shifted, countries like China, and to a lesser degree Russia, have become more capable of challenging American-led arrangements that they don't like. That could be the balance of power in the Western Pacific or in Eastern Europe. It could be a variety of things. But much of what we're seeing today, much of what's often referred to as great power competition, is simply a reflection of the fact that the balance of power has changed over the past 30 years. A third challenge, I think, was that while the ills of globalization are often exaggerated, it is true that globalization, and particularly the insertion of China into the global economy during the 1990s, exacerbated pressures on the working and middle class in the United States. It's a complicated equation because there were also some very significant benefits that flowed from that. But if you look at things like the decline of employment in American manufacturing, the reality is that most of that comes from trends like automation that have relatively little to do with international trade, but a portion of it does come from this insertion of China in the international economy and the globalization project more broadly. And so I think one of the things you saw in 2016, in that election in particular, was a backlash against the challenges, both real and perceived, associated with globalization. And then finally, a fourth challenge was that there emerged greater imbalances in some of America's key relationships over time. And so we often talk about this in the context of U.S. alliances and this problem of free riding, whereby American allies can underinvest in their own defense because they know that the United States has their backs. And in fact, that's kind of a feature rather than a glitch of U.S. alliances. One of the reasons that the United States commits to the defense of countries like Germany and Japan is that we worry that it might be destabilizing if these countries really felt like they had to entirely fend for themselves and spend 5 or 6% of GDP on their own defense. But nonetheless, it became clear, I would say, by the early 2010s that sort of the demilitarization of Europe, for instance, had reached a crisis point, in the sense that America's European allies were increasingly unable to help the United States, either in collective defense missions or in what was called out-of-area missions, so contributing meaningful combat power in something like the Libyan intervention in 2011. It turned out there were only 3 or 4 NATO allies that were able to do that. And there were economic imbalances in some of these relationships as well. And so on the eve of the 2016 election, I think it is fair to say that there were going to need to be adjustments in American foreign policy, regardless of who won that election. And I think you would have seen some of these adjustments even had Hillary Clinton won that election. It would have looked very different, no doubt. But I do think you would have seen a sharper China policy under a Clinton administration than you had seen under President Obama, just to give you one example. But of course, Secretary Clinton does not win the presidency in 2016. Donald Trump wins instead. And Trump brings more of a disruptive factor into American foreign policy. Because I think it's actually fair to say that President Trump himself, and I would distinguish him here from his administration for the reasons I'll talk about in a second, he personally rejects in some ways the underlying logic of US foreign policy since World War II. One of the big pieces of underlying logic of US foreign policy since World War II has been a positive sum worldview. The idea that the United States can thrive by helping like-minded countries thrive. When you hear President Trump talk about foreign policy, it's much more of a transactional, even zero-sum approach to international affairs. Who's getting the best of this particular deal or the best of that particular deal? And that's not necessarily inappropriate. That's simply a different way of looking at the world. But nonetheless, particularly when applied to American alliances, it represented a bit of a jarring shift in American foreign policy. President Trump, I think, also had some other differences with the underlying logic of American foreign policy. One of the ideas underpinning US foreign policy since 1945 has been this idea that America's closest, most consequential, deepest relationships are with the advanced democracies of Western Europe and East Asia, not simply because we share common interests with these countries, but because our political systems are rooted in common values. Obviously, for President Trump, he had a very difficult relationship with many of our European allies. And as he told Bob Woodward in the interview for Woodward's most recent book, he seemed to get along with dictators better than he did with democratic leaders like Chancellor Merkel in Germany. I think the president's logic was that it could be easier to get things done in dealing with autocratic leaders than in dealing with democratic leaders. But nonetheless, that too was a shift. And in other ways as well. The president, in ways that I don't need to talk about in great detail, was often skeptical of American alliances. He often advanced a more starkly nationalistic approach to international trade and economic policy than his predecessors had. And of course, he adopted this label of America First. And this was seen as being symbolic because the term America First had really gained prominence back in 1940, 1941, when it was the slogan that was adopted by a very prominent group and the people who were members of it who were opposed to American intervention in World War II, who advocated a much narrower definition of American interests. And so I would not consider President Trump an isolationist. I think that's an exaggerated critique, but nonetheless, he seemed to be channeling some of these earlier ideas. So the question was always, how seriously would President Trump reorient American foreign policy? And the reason that was a live question is because the president was such an outlier in the Republican Party. If you'll recall, virtually all of the leading Republican foreign policy elites had repudiated the president publicly before he was elected. He had few close advisors at the time of the election who were also foreign policy experts. And so he ended up surrounding himself with people who took more traditional views of American foreign policy. People like Jim Mattis or John Kelly or H.R. McMaster. People who believed that American foreign policy needed to be adapted because of the challenges that had built up over previous years, but were more committed, I think, to the post-war tradition in American foreign policy. And in fact, there's a famous meeting, which is relayed in a number of books, where the president goes to the Pentagon and his Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, and the Secretary of Defense, Mattis, try to explain to him why the United States has troops in South Korea, why it has alliance commitments around the world. And the president simply is not taken with the presentation. He's not convinced by it. And so what we see really over much of the Trump administration is kind of a tug of war between the president and some of his advisors. And so you would see kind of a two-speed American foreign policy where on the day-to-day level, there would continue to be a very good cooperation with NATO allies on defense and cybersecurity and that sort of thing. but summits of NATO leaders frequently blew up into acrimony, in part because of the approach that the president took to those summits. You saw a long struggle within the administration over whether the United States should stay in or get out of the Iran nuclear deal. The president wanted to get out. Many of his advisors wanted to stay in, not because they were soft on Iran, but because they believed that it was working in restraining an Iranian nuclear capability. Many of his advisors argued that the United States needed to shift toward great power competition with Russia and China. The president was often more interested in focusing on other things, whether North Korea in 2017 or Venezuela about a year and a half afterward. And so the point is, there have been competing impulses within the Trump administration over the past 4 years. And just to lay my own priors on the table, I think there have been constructive impulses from people who wanted to adjust U.S. foreign policy to new realities. I think there have also been more destructive impulses that have come from a commander-in-chief who was less committed to this traditional American role in the world. And this is not to say that foreign policy under the Trump administration has been entirely bad or entirely unproductive. That's not actually the case. I think that the president and a number of his advisors deserve some credit for reorienting American policy toward China, towards making the frame of that relationship one of competition rather than engagement, and frankly recognizing the degree to which the U.S. effort to bring China into the international system after the Cold War had not produced the desired results. I think it was entirely appropriate for the president to point out some of the ways in which America's allies needed to contribute more to the common cause, even if I think that some of the tactics he took in doing that were counterproductive. And in fact, the major critiques that I would offer the Trump administration are two. The fact is that even on issues where I think the president had the right instincts, like China, there was sometimes a failure to move from disrupting existing policies to creating new ones. And so the president obviously did shift the frame of US policy toward China, but at the same time, he took the United States out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would have been a trade deal with some pretty significant strategic importance and balancing Chinese influence in the Asia Pacific. And there's still nothing to fill that void. So that would be one critique. The second critique, I think, is that even though the president's policies often have not been as radical as his rhetoric, there have still been a number of areas in which the intangibles of American policy have shifted in some destructive ways. Certainly, political relationships with allies have been strained. I think America's reputation for steadiness and competent leadership has unfortunately been eroded. I think the perception that the United States is kind of the first responder running toward the fire when it comes to dealing with global challenges like climate change or COVID or strains in the national trading system. I think that has been eroded as well. And obviously, I think American soft power has taken a pretty significant dive over the past 4 years. In fact, there was some recent polling done by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, which indicated that populations in a number of democratic countries in Europe and East Asia, so these are America's closest allies, had less faith in the American president to do the right thing than they did in Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping. You can argue that says as much about the populations being surveyed as it does about the American president, but nonetheless, that's a troubling perception from the perspective of American influence. And so I think there have been some damaging impacts of this presidency. And I would come back to one in particular, which is this administration has frequently made essentially, as framed international relationships in power terms and taken sort of a starkly self-interested approach to international affairs, which again is the prerogative of every country in the international system. The challenge is this. The challenge is that the United States has long done so well in rallying coalitions, winning allies, winning friends in the international system because of the perception that we stand for something greater than our own power and our own benefit. And so if that's no longer the case, I think it raises some challenging questions about the future of American foreign policy. And so there had been this period, the Trump administration, where there were some constructive changes, also a number of very destructive changes. And in the middle of this, or I guess at the tail end rather, you have COVID, right? And so COVID has made the situation more complicated in a number of respects. I think it's raised further doubts about the competence of American leadership, the difficulty that the United States has had in devising a coherent national strategy for dealing with COVID, let alone the difficulty it's had in contributing to a broader international approach to the pandemic. I think has raised those questions. I think the pandemic, at least in the outset, it raised fears of deglobalization. It raised concerns that perhaps democracies weren't as well suited as autocracies to responding to the degrees. And so you actually found a number of very prominent international observers and academics who were arguing that COVID was going to mark the end of the American international order, that the combination of President Trump and COVID would bring the whole thing crashing down. And that was sort of a very bleak assessment. But if you think back to March and April 2020, it was a pretty bleak time. Here's the good news. I think there's actually a brighter picture emerging when we think about the future of American foreign policy. And I think what you have to keep in mind is that crises are challenges, but they're also opportunities. And I think that COVID has actually created some interesting opportunities for the United States. And so let me just mention 3 or 4 of these. The first is that COVID has created the potential for a more robust democratic coalition to counter the disturbing aspects of China's rise. If you look at the way that China is perceived around the world, China's own favorability ratings have plummeted over the past year. In part, that's because of the incredibly irresponsible way that the Chinese Communist Party dealt with COVID in the first place. In part, it's because the Chinese have pursued an offense on all fronts approach to foreign policy since the pandemic, again, pushing for advantage everywhere from the South China Sea to Hong Kong to Taiwan to the border with India to its relations with Europe. And so I think that the Chinese have actually done a very good job in concert with the pandemic of reminding democratic countries around the world of why they tend to side with the United States despite all of our problems and how much they would have to lose in an international environment in which China becomes preeminent. So that's one possibility to emerge from the crisis. A second possibility is that I think we may end up with a smarter, more geopolitically savvy version of globalization. And so what made globalization, I think, problematic was that it increasingly occurred across geopolitical lines during the years after the Cold War. So the United States became deeply interdependent with a country, China, that has turned out to be a geopolitical and ideological rival. Not all interdependence is bad, and the United States shouldn't try to completely seal itself off from economic dealings with China. That would be profoundly self-defeating and destabilizing. But I think what COVID has made clear is that it is in America's interest to selectively disentangle itself from China in key areas. These could be components that go into American munitions, it could be pharmaceuticals, it could be a variety of things. And the United States shouldn't pull back into autarky. What it should try to do is deepen its economic engagement and integration with like-minded countries, with other democracies, to establish more secure supply chains so that the United States and other democracies can continue to take advantage of the benefits of competition and comparative advantage, while also insulating themselves a little bit from the dangers of dependence on an authoritarian rival. I think the pandemic has similarly created an opportunity to reform international institutions that are important, but that were misfiring in key ways. The WHO, the World Health Organization, is perhaps the best example here. This is an organization that's done tremendous amounts of good over its existence. But as was revealed in the early stages of the pandemic, it had in many ways been captured. It had been influenced in undue ways by Chinese preferences, and so was not able to play a particularly constructive role early on. Here's the thing, though. Across all of these issues, taking advantage of the opportunities that COVID brings is going to require a degree of constructive American leadership that frankly has been lacking in recent months. And so instead of participating in the reform of the World Health Organization, the United States has said, we're taking our marbles and we're going home. We're getting out of that organization. The United States has not been deeply involved in the various vaccine summits or other international efforts to think about how the pandemic might end. And so I think there is going to need to be a shift in American policy in order to take advantage of this. And so I think the question arises, and I'll end here, is the Biden administration capable of this? Obviously, it's very difficult to say at such an early stage when the Biden administration hasn't even taken power at this point, but I think there are some pretty good signs. I think the Biden team seems generally committed to the idea that the United States needs to compete more effectively with China, but also to the idea that the United States needs to take a more multilateral approach to competing with China. One of the ideas that President-elect Biden has endorsed, for instance, which I think is a very good one, is the idea of a democratic tech coalition, a group of perhaps 10 to 12 advanced democracies that would pool their efforts to develop and facilitate the adoption of alternatives to Huawei for 5G networks and things of that sort. I think the Biden team has sent some good signals about prioritizing deepening democratic solidarity to deal with a number of challenges that the United States faces. And I will actually say here that I think that in this context, while I doubt very much that President-elect Biden is happy about this, having a Democratic White House, but a GOP-led Senate, which is where it looks like we'll end up, could actually have some beneficial consequences. And so there are a number of areas where GOP senators, such as Mitt Romney, have put forward ideas on China that pretty closely parallel some of the Biden administration's, the incoming Biden administration's own ideas on economic competition with China. So I actually think there'll be some interesting possibilities for cooperation there. There are some potential spanners in the works. If the United States ends up taking big chunks out of the defense budget, that would probably send the wrong signal right now. And I think that this administration needs to keep in mind that while it will get a big soft power bump when it comes into office, that just by virtue of not being President Trump, President Biden will come in with an enormous amount of goodwill from many of America's traditional allies and partners. That bump is only going to last so long. It won't carry the administration for years. It might carry the administration for months or so. And so ultimately there will be a need to deliver on constructive policies. So we will see how it turns out sooner rather than later. But I'll close on the optimistic note by saying that even though I think the US-led international system is under sharper challenges now than it has been at any time since the end of the Cold War, I think there are also some pretty significant strategic opportunities out there. And so my hope is that the incoming administration will be able to make the most of those. So I'll stop there, and I very much look forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you very much, Dr. Brands. You know, if you're in the foreign policy business, sometimes it seems like a prerequisite that you have to be a pessimist. So it's nice to hear some optimism occasionally. So we have some good questions from the audience. And for those of you who still would like to ask a question, you still have time to type it into the Q&A there, and I'll read them as they come up. So kind of a nice segue here at the end of your talk regarding the Biden administration. We have a question. By strengthening relationships with allies, will President Biden restore the United States' position of leadership in the world?
So I think it's important for someone like me who's been very critical of the Trump administration to be fair here and saying that there are areas in which the Trump administration has established pretty good cooperation with certain American allies. So for instance, the US-Japan relationship has remained quite strong over the past 4 years. US relations with a few Eastern European countries I'd place in that same category. But nonetheless, I mean, I think there has been serious reason for concern in looking at US relationships with countries like Germany and France and South Korea. So a number of America's most important relationships. I think there are two things that the Biden administration has going in its favor coming in and dealing with American allies. The first is simply that the Biden administration isn't the Trump administration. And I don't mean to be glib about that. I mean, just mean that alone will buy the United States a lot of goodwill in a number of European capitals, for instance. And it will also avert some of the dangers that I think had emerged of, say, a major blow up in the US-Japan or US-South Korea relationship over burden sharing issues, over issues of, say, how much the South Korean government is going to pay the United States to defray the costs of stationing American military personnel in South Korea. So that's one area in which I think the Biden administration comes in with an advantage. I think a second area is that the Biden administration, as I mentioned, has the right basic idea in terms of how the United States should be trying to face up to some of the challenges out there. And so I think the Biden administration, from what President-elect Biden has written, from what some of his likely advisors have said, thinks that an American response, whether it is in dealing with China or in dealing with the problem of authoritarianism more broadly, or even perhaps in dealing with issues like climate change, begins with deeper cooperation among the key democracies. It begins with the recognition that America's most important and closest relationships are with those countries with whom we share common values as well as common interests. I think that is an insight that has frequently eluded the current president. And so I'm happy to see that. And I think that will also have a significant impact on American alliance relationships in the coming years. That said, I think there are still some challenges ahead. And so, again, when President Trump would criticize American allies for not spending enough on defense, he was often doing so in a counterproductive way. But I think the basic problem he had identified wasn't entirely wrong. When he was upset with the Germans about some of their economic policies, again, the basic critique, even if expressed in a destructive way, wasn't entirely wrong. And so the Biden administration is going to have to tackle some of these same issues. The United States does need more out of the allies. It needs more out of Germany in terms of its ability to help NATO respond to contingencies in Eastern Europe. It needs more out of a non-allied partner like Taiwan in terms of hardening Taiwan against a potential Chinese invasion. And so the Biden administration is definitely going to have to confront those issues as well and figure out how to encourage greater overall commitments to the common good without risking some of the more counterproductive tendencies of the Trump administration. There's one other challenge I think the Biden administration will have to confront, which is that within some of America's core alliances, there's a growing problem of illiberalism today. So if you look at the eastern flank of NATO, Turkey is increasingly an illiberal system. Hungary is increasingly an illiberal autocratic system. Poland has shown some very troubling tendencies as well. And this is a classic dilemma for the United States. How do you deal with important allies that are moving in unhelpful or potentially dangerous political directions? There's no easy solution to that. And so that challenge too, I think, will confront the Biden administration.
More specifically, should a Biden administration seek to resurrect the TPP as a multilateral approach to containing China?
So yes, but with a twist, right? And so the unexpected outcome of the United States withdrawing from TPP back in 2017 was not that the agreement collapsed as everybody thought. It's that the agreement just went ahead without the United States. And so the remaining 11 countries formed something called CPTPP, which is basically a modified version of the initial agreement. And it's actually gotten off the ground quite nicely over the past 3.5 years. And so my own view is that the United States should look to enter that agreement. I mean, I think the challenge is frankly that we may not get as good a deal as we would have had from the original TPP because the agreement has moved on. But on a broader sense, the United States does need to be looking for ways of providing countries in the Asia Pacific and beyond alternatives to economic reliance on China. TPP was never really about what it was going to do for the United States economically. It was going to have a very, a positive impact, but a very marginal economic impact on the United States. TPP was what it was going to do for countries like Vietnam, countries that are worried about Chinese assertiveness and expansion, but have become very dependent on Chinese markets and money. And TPP was going to help reorient those countries or give them economic alternatives and thus strategic alternatives to China. I think that imperative is still quite important. It goes beyond simple trade policy at this point. It reaches into areas like technological innovation as well. But I think that absolutely should be a strategic priority for the United States.
Can you expand on the image of China in the world today? For example, has it taken a huge hit among the underdeveloped countries where it has worked so hard to access resources? And will there be long-term effects?
That's a really interesting question. And it actually goes to the issue I'm addressing in my weekly column, which I was working on today. I think one of the key impacts of the past year has been that it's more and more likely that America's key democratic allies will line up with the United States, not on every issue, but in a broad sense in dealing with a rising China. That's been the trend of the past year. I'm less confident in saying that about the developing nations, really in regions from Southeast Asia to Sub-Saharan Africa to Latin America, because I think some of the characteristics that predispose advanced democracies to resist Chinese assertiveness are not necessarily there in those cases. And so developing nations tend to be more attracted by the lure of relatively low cost physical or digital infrastructure that opens doors for China. In some, by no means all cases, democracy and the rule of law is less firmly established in some developing regions than it is in, say, Western Europe, which creates other entry points for Chinese influence, and so on and so forth. Now, I think the Chinese have in some ways overreached in parts of the developing world. And so there is a perception in parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, that the Chinese are mostly interested in resource extraction as opposed to promoting sort of sustainable development. But nonetheless, I think the challenge for the United States and other democracies is going to be sharper in the third world than it will be in places like Europe, because the conditions there are a bit more conducive to the expansion of Chinese influence.
Got a question about your book, Lessons of Tragedy. You discuss contemporary amnesia as a contributor to a loss of tragic sensibility. What do you see as either short-term or long-term strategic approaches for addressing contemporary amnesia?
Well, beyond reading the book, I would say that I think this is why a study of history is so important, right? And so if you want to know the answer to the question of, why does the United States have alliances that reach around the world? Why does the United States promote and anchor an open international economic system, even when doing so may create short-term dislocations for certain industries and producers within the United States? Why does the United States take an interest in what happens in a country like Ukraine, which is thousands of miles from America's border, or Taiwan, which is located on China's doorstep? There are actually good answers to those questions if you go back to the history of what happened before the United States started doing those things. And I think it really comes back to the lessons that American policymakers learned from the 1930s and 1940s, that international order is not inherently robust, it is inherently fragile. And without constant support from leading powers, it will eventually fracture and collapse. Now, the sort of both the good news and the danger is that the American-led international system has been so successful for so long in creating a relatively stable and prosperous world that we sometimes forget that this isn't the natural state of things. The natural state of things across history has been a much more sort of authoritarian, impoverished, and violent status quo. And so one of the reasons I study history, one of the reasons that I recommend that anyone who wants to become a policymaker or a political leader study history is simply because it can help us remember why the United States does these things in the first place without having to pick up that knowledge from sort of tragedies in our own time.
I guess we can't let you leave without talking a little bit about Russia. So we have an interesting question that says, how do you see the international world changing with Putin stepping down?
Well, it may be because I haven't been following the news today, but if Putin is stepping down, I am unaware of that. I think that my understanding of what is happening in Russia is that Putin has laid the groundwork to remain in power until 2036, if I recall correctly, by basically rejiggering the electoral system in the Constitution there. And so I think, unfortunately, the United States is going to be dealing with a President Putin for a number of years to come. And I think that, the bad news here is that it means that U.S.-Russia relations are unlikely to improve over the near term. Now, that's not all about personality. There are geopolitical reasons why the U.S. and Russia have a very conflicted relationship. I think Russia would like to establish a sphere of influence in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. The United States would prefer to avoid that. There are ideological reasons why the United States and Russia clash. Russia is obviously an oligarchic, authoritarian regime. The United States prefers to work with democracies. Nonetheless, I think there is a certain amount of personal animosity that is built up on President Putin's part toward the United States, in part because of things that happened 30 years ago surrounding the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, and in part because of things that have happened more recently. And so I think it would be very much be in America's interest to have a better relationship with Russia. I actually think it would be in Russia's interest as well to have a better relationship with the West. The Russians have made the strategic decision over a number of years that they're going to pursue a deeper partnership with China as they also pursue a more hostile relationship with the West. I think that's unlikely to pay dividends for Russia over the long term. And I think that if Chinese power continues to grow, China may ultimately pose a threat to Russia as much as it does to the United States and American allies. Nonetheless, I think in the near term, in the next 5, 10, 15 years, the drivers of U.S.-Russian hostility are likely to remain relatively strong. And so I don't have a huge amount of hope about where the relationship is going. That doesn't mean that the United States shouldn't try to stabilize the relationship where it makes sense to do so. I think renewing the New START Treaty, for instance, this is basically a nuclear arms control agreement between the United States and Russia, makes sense simply because there's not a lot of strategic advantage for the United States in having an unconstrained nuclear arms race at the moment. But nonetheless, I think on the whole, the relationship is likely to remain somewhat frosty.
Yeah, and I was not aware that Putin was stepping down either, but the person who asked the question followed up and said that he may be stepping down due to a diagnosis of Parkinson's disease. So that have to look into that and see if that's the case. Yeah, interesting. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Brands. And thank you to everybody in attendance tonight for joining us. We hope that you will join us for our future events in the Global Decisions series, and you can always find out what we're doing, our events and our activities by going to our website or following us on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. And let's give one more big thank you to Dr. Brands for such an insightful and optimistic discussion. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Have a good night, everyone.